everybody. My pleasure this morning to introduce Joe Jensen, one of our chief fellows, who will be speaking to us. Joe is a native of Eden Prairie, Benilde High School. He went to Notre Dame, and in his summers, he worked as a CNA at one of the local assisted livings in Eden Prairie. He went to the University of Minnesota Medical School, took 2 years off in the middle of med school to found two medical device companies. So this topic is fairly relevant to him. He was a resident at Abbott here, where I became acquainted with him. He was a chief resident. He's worked with our prevention group with Mike Miedema and has a number of publications with them. He's boarded in Echo and in Nuke. He's a connoisseur of the local entertainment scene. He's kind of our entertainment coordinator for the fellow expert on local restaurants. But seriously, he played a huge role using his own time this year to help recruit this outstanding group of fellows. So we really appreciate that. He's an expert clinician, compassionate physician. We were hopeful he would join us, but he's going to be staying within Alina and joining the Mercy Cardiology group. He's going to be talking to us this morning about medical devices, which is timely. I think it comes up almost every day in clinic, someone showing you their Apple Watch or some other device that they have. So he's going to tell us what that's all about. So thanks, Joe.
All right, thank you, Dr. Harris, for the kind introduction. And I'd like to start, first of all, by thanking each and every one of you here in the room and online, as you all have either directly or indirectly impacted my training these past 7 years. And not just the cardiologists, but the APPs, the nurses, the techs, my co-fellows, everyone here at the foundation, and the same goes for all those listening online at Hennepin. I really, truly believe that I couldn't have had a better training experience these last 7 years, and that's all thanks to you, so I'm very grateful. I appreciate it very much. I have one disclosure relevant to the talk today, as Dr. Harris mentioned, and that is the company Dose Health. I'm the co-founder, equity holder, and current board member. And so as I reflected on exactly what I would be talking about today, I took a look at this academic year's Grand Rounds roster by itself, and I quickly realized that I am very far out of my league, to put it mildly. Each of these people represent serious expertise in their fields and truly represent the cutting edge of cardiology. So as I reflected back on my fellowship training, I decided to go the opposite direction and pursue the duller fundamental side of cardiology, which is the guidelines. And not to say that the guidelines are bad, but to get back to the basics, you'll see the hypertension guidelines on the left and the most recent diabetes guidelines here on the right. And there are specific phrases that keep popping up in both sets of these guidelines. Optimal lifestyle habits, and no need for you to read it, I'll read it for you. Intensive lifestyle behavior change, non-pharmacologic therapy. These squishy topics were never really covered in medical school, residency, or beyond, and it's really hard to digest the bulky guidelines, much less these less scientific, squishy topics. But as I kept reading, they kept popping up. And so this is, again, ripped directly from the hypertension guidelines. And that effective behavioral and motivational strategies to achieve a healthy lifestyle, i.e. tobacco cessation, weight loss, moderation in alcohol intake, increased physical activity, reduced sodium intake, and consumption of a healthy diet are recommended for adults with hypertension. Sounds pretty simple. Not so much. So in my search to uncover exactly what these phrases mean, I came across Life's Essential 8 by the American Heart Association. And these are what they identify as key measures to a healthy lifestyle. These were released in 2022 and were an upgrade from the previous version, which was labeled the Simple 7, to also include sleep to make it the Essential 8. The others include eating healthy, moving more, managing diabetes, managing weight, controlling cholesterol, managing blood pressure, and smoking cessation. And so I most definitely agree with the upgrade from simple to essential, but I do find it ironic that we as cardiologists, endocrinologists, nephrologists, primary care doctors, APPs, we receive little to no training in these fields, and really have a hard time understanding these for ourselves, much less having the capacity to address these with our patients. So to simplify all that, and I'll try to do that quite a bit in this talk today, we are not good at this, nor do we have the time. We are not good at this, nor do we have the time. So who could possibly step in to address these essential 8 measures that literally impact everyone alive? Industry. Obviously, a target market this lucrative couldn't possibly be passed up. And so a quick show of hands for everybody in here, and then those online, feel free to raise your hand too. How many of you own or have used a smart wearable device or non-wearable device, any sort of smart device? Raise your hands. Okay, that's a much higher ratio, which is what I expected. And right now in the United States, I saw about 2/3 of the hands raised, maybe 3/4. In the United States, 1 out of 5 Americans own or have used a smart device. And that number is expected to increase dramatically. And if you look at the overall world market size, in 2019, it was estimated to be worth 14.6, almost 15 billion. But by 2025, that number is expected to increase massively up to 70 billion. These devices are not going away. So it's our job as care providers to understand what's out there, what the data means, and start to think about how we integrate this both into our practice and into our lives. So using this essential 8 as a framework, I'll give a brief introduction and overview to some of the most commonly and less commonly used devices on the market today. And it turns out these seemingly simple devices are backed both by basic science and outcomes data. So without further ado, let's get started. I'll start with Move More, and with each topic introduction, I'll show the infographic that's displayed with each essential 8 category, talk through that briefly, and then why we care about it. So in Move More, this is pretty simple stuff. They recommend 150 minutes of moderate activity or 75 minutes of vigorous activity, and really basic things: be strong, use weights, add intensity, sit less, set goals, very, very generic things. So why do we as cardiologists care about all of this? Well, it turns out physical activity is inversely related to cardiovascular outcomes. And this is all very basic, but I think it's really important for us to understand the data behind it. So to cover 2 of these studies, the first one is a meta-analysis of 48 studies with 2.6 million patients. And so 750 MET-min was the baseline activity level. And to kind of explain what that means, we're all familiar with metabolic equivalence, but MET-min of 1 is when somebody's at rest. And so 750 was found to be the baseline activity level, and that's equivalent to the following measures below. If you're running at 6 miles an hour, that equals 10 METs, and so you're talking about 75 minutes of exercise a week. You're a little bit slower, a little bit more reasonable, 4 miles an hour, a brisk walk, that's 5 METs, and by my math, you'll have to take my word for it, that's 150 minutes of exercise per week. But a slower walk, 2 miles an hour, we're talking about 300 minutes of exercise a week, and you can do the math yourself to determine what daily exercise limits that would mean. The interesting thing about this study is that the whole purpose of it was to actually see if increased activity levels above the recommendations, like ultra-endurance athletes or marathon runners, actually put people at increased risk for cardiovascular disease and mortality. Turns out that wasn't the case, and you can see here on the x-axis where you have the MET minutes per week, and the y-axis, the CVD mortality hazard ratio. And here's baseline of 1, which corresponds to that 750 that I talked about. And so if you have less than 750 MET-mins a week, you're at increased risk for CVD mortality. Anything above 750 MET-minutes a week, you can see your risk go down essentially linearly with increased activity levels. So they disproved their initial hypothesis to show that increased activity is associated with reduced CVD mortality. And again, a reminder, this is CVD mortality. This isn't an improvement in a symptom score or something soft like that. Another study looking at 16,000, almost 17,000 people from the Women's Heart Health Study wore an accelerometer for 7 days between 2011 and 2015. Their average step count was 5,500 a day. And looking at this is again mortality. And so at 2,000, which was the baseline that they determined here, anything above that pretty much led to reduced mortality. And they determined that 4,400 steps per day, which is actually less than the previous study, 4,400 or more was increased, was associated with significantly lower mortality. And after you got above 7,500 steps a day, that benefit really leveled off. So we're familiar with 10,000 steps a day, but really the data here would show that really around 7,500 steps per day is really what you should be targeting to reduce your risk of CVD mortality as much as possible. So why is this the case? And there are a couple key fundamental metrics that maybe play a role here, that definitely play a role here. And the first is heart rate. And this is a study of 2 million patients from 45 prospective cohort studies. And these are adjusted not to include rate control agents. So on the x-axis in both of these cases is the resting heart rate in beats per minute. And on the y-axis is the relative risk for coronary artery disease on the left and non-cardiovascular disease on the right. And if you look at this corresponds to a heart rate of 70. So a resting heart rate of 70, if you're less than that, your relative risk for coronary artery disease decreases. If you're higher than that, your risk increases. And there are a couple different models shown here. Same for non-cardiovascular disease. If your heart rate's above 70, you're at a higher risk. So this is another interesting study, the Beautiful study, which is back in 2008, which actually looked at ivabradine in patients with stable coronary artery disease. That turned out to be a negative trial for ivabradine, but there was pretty interesting subgroup analysis within that trial to show different groups that are outlined here and split with this top line of a heart rate greater than 70 and this bottom line with a heart rate less than 70. Top left, we're looking at CVD death on the y-axis. On the top right, you're looking at heart failure admission, MI admission, and revascularization. So in all categories, if your heart rate is above 70, you're at higher risk for CVD death, heart failure admission, MI admission, and revascularization. So moving on to the next metric, heart rate variability. And we're going to take a quick detour back to medical school and talk about the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system. And one of the things that actually made sense to me, and one of the things to remember what these meant, rest and digest for the parasympathetic system, fight or flight for the sympathetic system. And so at the parasympathetic level, you're constricting your pupils, saliva, you're resting, you're digesting. Sympathetic system, you're dilating the pupils, accelerating your heart rate, inhibiting peristalsis, stimulating glucose production to consume energy quickly. And so zooming in on these particular receptors in the heart, we have sympathetic on the left, parasympathetic on the right. We're very familiar with these sympathetic receptors because this is what all of our medications target. The beta-1, beta-2 receptors, the alpha receptors in the heart. And we know what they do with the heart, arteries, veins, and lungs, so I'm not going to go into any detail with that. The muscarinic receptors, we don't have really any medications that target those, so we kind of forget about it. But again, that's the parasympathetic. We're decreasing heart rate. We're decreasing the force of contraction. We're decreasing conduction velocity. So the definition of heart rate variability is the physiologic variation in the duration of intervals between sinus beats. And so for some of those savvy EKG readers out there, you're probably thinking, but what about respiratory sinus arrhythmia? How does this work? And so we're going to take a quick detour, and I'm expecting 100% participation out of everybody here. We're going to do a little physiology experiment ourselves. So find your pulse on your carotid or your radial artery. We're going to take a deep breath and hold it. We're going to exhale, and we're going to see what happens. So you got to do it with me, otherwise it's going to be weird. Okay, deep breath in. And my heart rate's probably beating faster than yours at this point. But with inhalation, the diaphragm contracts, the intrathoracic pressure lowers, the atrial pressure lowers, more blood returns to the heart, the atria expand, that triggers the baroreceptors, and that suppresses the vagal tone. So your heart rate increased, and you may have been noticing that your heart rate increased as you took that deep breath. With exhalation, now no surprise, the opposite happens. Diaphragm relaxes, chest cavity decreases, intrathoracic pressure increases, less venous return, inactivation of baroreceptors, not suppressing the vagal tone, and your heart rate decreases. So the takeaway here is that heart rate increases with inspiration and decreases with expiration, and that's respiratory sinus arrhythmia. Now this next point, you're just gonna have to take my word for it, but there are multiple calculations that we can use to calculate heart rate variability, and the most accurate that takes this respiratory sinus arrhythmia into account is the root mean square of the differences in successive RR intervals, RMSSD. Rolls right off the tongue. That's preferred. There are other calculations too, but that one is the most accurate. And essentially the takeaway point here is the higher the heart rate variability, the higher the parasympathetic output. So why do we care? We're not going to go through all of this. It doesn't matter. But these are studies that show heart rate variability and outcomes data. A couple of the highlights here. Patients in the lower tertile have increased risk of all-cause mortality with a hazard ratio of 3.7. A low heart rate variability had increased risk of all-cause mortality compared with a higher heart rate variability. And that's a 34% versus a 9% risk. And the risk for all-cause mortality was increased with lower heart rate variability. So again, we're talking about parasympathetic and sympathetic inputs. If your sympathetic input is higher, you're at a higher risk for all-cause mortality. The other interesting thing about heart rate variability more recently is that it's not just for the sick. And studies have shown that daily recordings of HRV are superior at increasing fitness and exercise performance than training based on conventional methods. And so that's a measure of recovery. So if your heart rate variability is high, that's a training day where you can really push yourself. If your heart rate variability is low, maybe you'd benefit from a rest day. So why? What's the importance of this heart rate and heart rate variability? You can probably already put it together based on the physiology that we just talked about, but a high heart rate increases hemodynamic stress and shortens the diastolic phase. So we're talking about increased mechanical load, tensile and shear stresses. We have increased blood pressure and cardiac work. We have increased oxygen consumption. And we know that high heart rate variability is a marker for sympathetic overactivity. And so you're at increased risk for VF, any other arrhythmia, and insulin resistance as well. But the good news is that increased activity levels can lead to a lower resting heart rate and an increased heart rate variability. So a quick timeline of some tools that have been developed over the years to measure these things. The first pedometer was actually developed in 1760, the first EKG here in 1895. Fast forward to 1935, the first pulse oximeter was invented. And this is a key here in 1965. This is the first MEMS device, micro electromechanical system, and this really allows for all of these sensor technologies to be developed in a form factor that can actually work in sensor technologies. 2009 was a huge year as Fitbit releases their first product, their first pedometer that clipped to the belt. 2018, Apple Watch reduces their first watch with a single lead EKG. And of course, we've got plenty in the future pipeline. So to zoom in here, between 2009 with Fitbit and 2018 with Apple Watch, there was an explosion of devices in the market. We've got the Nike Fuel Band that some of you might recognize. Jawbone Up was another really popular one, the Pebble smartwatch, and many, many others. Now, there is a particular device near and dear to my heart, which is the Fitbit Flex in May of 2013, because fast forward 1 year later, when Lauren and I were married at Notre Dame, I decided that it would be a good idea to wear that Fitbit Flex during the wedding. Lauren less excited about it, but I knew that almost 9 years later, this would certainly be pertinent in a Grand Rounds conversation, so I am very glad that I wore that Fitbit Flex that day. So how do these devices work? There are two components here, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm a physics expert, but essentially the two important parts are a triaxial accelerometer that measures movement in the X, Y, and Z axis. And the reason this can be done is because of those MEMS devices. These are extremely small sensors, which makes sense based on the devices that we know they're in. And then there's a gyroscope, and that determines orientation and rotation. And combined, these two simple sensors lead to the 6 degrees of freedom: up, down, back, forward, left, right with the accelerometer, and then roll and pitch with the gyroscope. You combine those with the GPS, and you can really pinpoint position accuracy. Devices typically use 4 satellites, despite triangulation, as you can see here being 3 satellites. You can get an accuracy of less than 5 meters, as long as the satellite geometry is right, there isn't any signal blockage, and some buildings, like being downtown, would limit the accuracy of that satellite data. But putting it all together, this is kind of a simplified algorithm of what these softwares behind these sensors are able to do. But they're continuously collecting all of the data, both from the accelerometer, the gyroscope, and the satellite with the location sensing. They're putting it together, they're analyzing the data, and then these devices are learning what's sleeping, what's working, and what's everything in between. So What about heart rate and heart rate variability? There are a few different ways that sensor technologies look at these metrics. The first, as I mentioned, pulse oximetry, and it's a ratio of red to infrared light. And so basically, those pulse oximeters send out a beam of red and infrared light. Oxygenated blood, as we know, is brighter than deoxygenated blood. And this infrared light beam and the red light beam measure the intensity of both shades. They then detect the pulse, and they subtract the intensity of shade when the pulse is absent. And so the remaining intensity is oxygenated red blood. PPG, or photoplethysmography, it's the last time I'll say that, is an optical technique that detects blood volume changes in a microvascular bed. And basically all devices use this technique. And so we'll talk more about that, but it's important to keep in mind that when you hear about devices detecting things like AFib, that doesn't necessarily mean they're using an EKG, they're using this technology, PPG. And then, of course, there's single lead EKG or multi-lead EKG that we'll talk about with devices such as Apple Watch, AliveCore. There are others, but I'm not going to touch on all of them. And so it's important that the devices that we use for these metrics are accurate. And so I'll be showing validation studies for all the different devices and all the different metrics. And so here on the x-axis, you see the gold standard ECG-derived heart rate. And then on the y-axis, you have the device minus ECG difference in heart rate. And so these are three of the devices that I'll talk about today: the Apple Watch, Whoop, and Oura. And you can see they correlate really, really well. Might jump out at you that Whoop seems to have the best correlation. But really, all of them perform satisfactorily well. Oura's is a little bit wider in the differences because of a couple outliers here. So again, this is not something that I'm going to go through in detail, but this is a table that looks at these different devices and the number of studies, number of clinical trials, number of cardiovascular clinical trials of all these devices. So if you look at something like Fitbit, which has the most studies, there are 612 studies with a Fitbit on PubMed. 530 of them are clinical trials, and 40 of them are cardiovascular clinical trials. So these devices are already being studied extensively, and that's expected to increase in the coming years. So to jump into the consumer side of these devices, I wanted to start with the most familiar to a lot of people, and that's the Apple Watch. And so here, the 41 millimeter is $400. You have the single lead EKG, which I think is really clever, where one of the leads is below the watch face, and then the other lead is actually on the crown. So connecting these two, you connect your left and your right to form that single lead. I just thought that kind of user interface and that device interaction is really clever. The key component with the Apple Watch is the power of all of the apps that can be used with the Apple Watch. I'm certainly not going to go through each of those apps, but all of that data can combine into the Apple Health app, and you really get a full picture of all the data from the watch in one particular app and location. To take a quick tangent, I think this is an important study to talk about because this large-scale assessment of a smartwatch to identify atrial fibrillation, they used an Apple Watch, really will ultimately be the foundation for future device validation studies and outcomes data too, as I'll talk about. So this was 420,000 patients over 8 months, and this was to look at whether or not a PPG device, again, this is not an EKG device at this point, this is just PPG, could detect AFib in those without AFib history. And so the way that they did this is that irregularity was detected by the pulse, and if irregularity was detected, the device would wait until the patient's at rest and then take 4 more readings. If it was still irregular by the time they were fully at rest, a notification was sent for them to reach out to schedule a telemedicine visit, and an EKG patch was mailed for them to wear for 7 days. 90 days after the patch was mailed, the patients were sent a survey. So out of those 420,000 patients, less than 1%, or 2,100 patients, received an irregular pulse notification. 450 of those patients, so about one quarter of those patients, returned an EKG patch, and atrial fibrillation was present in 34% of those. But there was a positive predicted value of 0.84 for atrial fibrillation on the EKG patch with an irregular pulse notification. And so subsequent deep neural network training led to a sensitivity of 98% and a specificity of 90% in pre-cardioversion patients using this PPG technology. And so ultimately, a lot of patients, not a lot of AFib, those that got notified, 25% of them sent in for the data, but the positive takeaway here is that there was a positive predictive value of 0.84. So I'll kind of refer to that as we move forward. Moving into another company, kind of the granddaddy of them all, Fitbit. A lot of different smartwatches here on the left, and then some activity trackers on the right. And you'll see the most expensive here is the Google Watch, that's $400, all the way down to the least expensive. It's a Minions smart activity tracker for kids. And I think that's pretty cool to point out, actually, that Fitbit is paying attention to activity monitors for kids. And in addition to these prices for the devices here, you'll see this as a common theme in that there's a monthly membership option too, to have better access to the data, more data analysis, and everything else. So of course, like any good company, you want to get money for your device itself, but the recurring revenue is the real kicker. Moving into Whoop, and so these are some of the things that I think people may be less familiar with. You'll notice some of the not so subtle differences in marketing as I talk about Whoop and then Oura. Whoop is a wrist-worn device that's always on. The beauty of this device is that it never has to be taken off. The charger actually plugs into the top of the Whoop device. So you charge the charger, put it on the top of the device never comes off. You're constantly tracking your data. And their mission is to unlock human performance. And so they do that in 3 different key metrics. Day strain, which is a combination of activity, heart rate, respirations. That's their proprietary algorithm to detect how much activity you do each day. They track the sleep, the different stages of sleep, and then your recovery. And your recovery, again, is a combination of respiratory rate, heart rate variability. And these are in a constant feedback loop, which is pretty interesting because the device will also give you recommendations as to when your optimal bedtime would be, when your optimal awake time should be, based on your recovery and how hard you should train that day. So these target strain metrics are built based on your goal daily strain is based on how well you recovered. And this particular device really came to light during COVID and had a really interesting story with the PGA Tour. And so this is back in June of 2021. PGA was one of the first sports to start up again after COVID for obvious reasons, given that it's a very individual sport. It can be appropriately socially distanced. And so in June of 2021, Nick Watney was going through the RBC Heritage Classic in South Carolina. And there were very strict testing protocols. So typically, a PGA tournament, there are practice rounds on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then competition Thursday through Sunday. And so the PGA decided that they would test every day before practice rounds, and if you cleared that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you're socially isolating, they don't need to test through the weekend. And so Watney cleared his testing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, played in a competitive round Thursday, and woke up Friday morning and looked at his Whoop data and noticed that his respiratory rate was a full 2 points higher than it normally was. I think the numbers were 14 at baseline, and this morning he woke up in 16. And he's like, that data is not right. That's never happened before. He was totally asymptomatic, but he let the PGA Tour know, and the PGA Tour said, well, you don't need to be tested. You've passed all our protocols. He's like, no, I think actually something is wrong. And so he withdrew from the tournament, tested positive for COVID later on Friday. So that kind of set off this entire chain of events where pretty soon after this, all PGA Tour players were wearing Whoop devices, and Whoop published some studies that showed early correlation with positive COVID testing based on respiratory rate increase, even without symptoms. And so the relationship with the PGA escalated pretty quickly over the course of the year. This is fast forward to about a year later in June of 2021, and this is Rory McIlroy at the Wells Fargo Championship. And in addition to players wearing the Whoop device for their own personal performance optimization, Whoop Live was developed, so you could actually see the heart rate of these players in real time. And so I'm going to show a clip here of Rory McIlroy on the 18th hole, the final round of the weekend, with a 2-shot lead.
It's going to be left, fortunately, on the other side. It should stay up. It's long.
130 is his heart rate right now, and you think, oh, well, he's probably swinging pretty hard with the driver. That's why his heart rate is so high. That's pretty interesting. Up to 140 now because he pulled it a little bit. Can't miss it left. Now he's in the rough. 117.
Wow, did this come out beautifully? Just right of the flag.
Up to 130, he stuck it again. He's got a 2-shot lead here, so that was a really key shot. And to finish things off, his final putt, his heart rate is about 130.
The roars have returned in golf.
This was one of the first tournaments with crowds again post-COVID. And so his heart rate gets all the way up to 140. So from tee to green, this golfer, this really fit professional golfer, Rory McIlroy, had a sustained heart rate of 130. So I think we just came to the evidence-based conclusion that golf is most certainly a sport. So I wanted to go down that tangent just to make that point. But now bringing it back to medicine, this is another example of what a workout metric would look like. And so you have the time here, which is a 50-minute workout, and these blue tracings are heart rate. 150 is about here, 125 is here. And so you see the heart rate going up and down like this. You have 592 calories. The average heart rate was 143, max was 173, and the duration was 57 minutes and 36 seconds. It turns out this actually wasn't a workout. This was a senior resident in the ICU managing a crashing patient for 57 minutes. And this patient was coding in and out, and this particular senior resident wasn't the one on the bed doing compressions, wasn't running around. This was simply the mental strain of managing a crashing patient in the ICU. And so this is really eye-opening data into literal strain that we put our bodies through, maybe not on a daily basis, but we see it quite often. And I think it's something important to recognize that it's not just golfers with strain, but we face pretty significant strain on a daily basis ourselves at times. And I would also refer you to last spring's Grand Rounds talk, and I'm blanking on his name right now, who came in and talked about optimizing individual and organizational performance, and his company used Whoop as a way to measure those metrics. So looking at the membership options here, they're monthly. It's very expensive. If you go month to month, it's $30 a month. If you're looking at a 24-month, you pay $480 upfront, and you get 2 years. So moving to the softer side of things, Oura is a ring that you wear on your index finger. And at Oura, we know that you are the source of your truth. Health starts from understanding you, and great health starts with good sleep. And that's where this company really started. This was their foundational technology offering, and that they really wanted to be the best at tracking sleep. And that's exactly what they've accomplished. And so it's the industry-leading sleep tracker. 86% of Oura members saw an improvement in their sleep quality, 98% heart rate variability accuracy. We talked a little bit about the heart rate accuracy here. The app is softer, it's friendlier, the interface is really good. And over the past couple years, they've improved their activity algorithms, so you actually get a pretty good activity monitor too. It's a little bit harder with a ring that kind of limits some of the physical activity, like with golf or in the gym with weights, less convenient than a wrist strap, but it's certainly a much improved activity tracker over what it was before. And just like Whoop recovery, they call it the readiness score, is really important. And again, that's a combination of your heart rate variability, respirations, and how well you sleep at night. So Oura is $350 with a recurring $6 a month subscription. And when you order one of these, if you haven't done it before, a little box comes, and you actually have a sizing kit where they have little plastic models of all the Ouras. You pick out your size, and then they send it back. Now, this is a device that many of us might be familiar with already, having referred our patients to some of these, and this is Cardia by AliveCor. And these two devices are single-lead EKGs, and it is, at this point, the most physician-prescribed over-the-counter device to track heart rhythms. And this device is capable of detecting AFib, bradycardia, tachycardia, normal sinus, PVCs, PACs, and a wide QRS. Their new offering, which was new to me, is actually credit card sized, where people can keep it in their wallet, pull it out, push the button, put their thumbs on the leads as you see here, and get a pretty good single lead EKG recording. That's for $100. The old version, which is a little bit bigger, easily fits in a pocket, is $80 at this point. But of course, there's the monthly subscription. You've got the basic CardiaCare, which is $100 a year, and CardiaCare Plus, which gives you more support from medical professionals and also gives a blood pressure cuff, which is pretty interesting. This, I thought, was also extremely clever. This is their most updated offering, the Cardia Mobile 6-lead. And you have the single lead device on top on the left and the right here, but on the bottom of the device is actually another lead, so you're able to assemble a 6-lead, complete limb lead look at an EKG. And actually, the other interesting part about how they market this device is for clinicians to use in clinic. I mean, imagine how quickly a 6-lead EKG, if you're looking to confirm sinus rhythm, this takes 30 seconds. Getting an EKG in clinic, probably five, sometimes 10 minutes, depending on the patient. So a really handy tool, not just for consumers, but they market it for clinicians as well. So this is another aside, and actually this is so hot off the press that this particular study hasn't even been published yet. And I wanted to take a quick second to acknowledge the Pager. For those of you that don't know, the Pager is a weekly newsletter that summarizes the most high-yield articles that were released each week, some kind of high-hitting industry news, some trivia, and an imaging study of the week. Super valuable. Definitely recommend that you sign up if you haven't already, and this is certainly not sponsored. But this is the only reason I'm aware of this study, and this is the Basel Wearable study, and it's a clinical validation of 5 direct-to-consumer wearable smart devices to detect AFib. And so this was 201 consecutive patients presenting to cardiology service at a tertiary center, and AFib was present in 32% of those patients. And looking at these 5 devices, Apple, Samsung, Withings, Fitbit, and AliveCor, you can see the sensitivity and specificity of detecting AFib in a real-world setting. The Apple Watch performed the best at 85% sensitivity and 75% specificity. And however, 18% of the single-lead EKG tracings were inconclusive. But the good thing is that after manual review of those tracings, 99% of them were confirmed. So maybe the software itself isn't perfect, but if you actually take a look at the ones that are inconclusive, you're able to make a determination 99% of the time. There are other metrics here talking about the limit of heart rate interpretation. I actually found an error here. They mentioned that AliveCor, the Cardia device, can only detect heart rates in 50 to 100 beats per minute. That's certainly not true. Their rate is 40 to 140. So I was kind of just wondering about this table in general when I found that very notable error. But again, it shows Apple Watch is outperforming all of these, ironically including the AliveCor Cardia device. So as Apple Watch's algorithms get better and better, this is something to watch for as the sensitivity and specificity will only continue to grow from here. The other interesting part here is that these 201 consecutive patients had to choose which one of these to buy. These were not sponsored. And for almost 40% of the time, the Apple Watch was the preferred choice, despite the fact that it was the most expensive. So it was $450 versus the cheapest Cardia Mobile at $150, still chosen 40% of the time. These are other studies beyond activity, heart rate, and heart rate variability using these smart technologies. The important one to mention here is Heartline. That's essentially that Apple Watch study that I mentioned earlier in the New England Journal, but also focused on outcomes data. So instead of just detecting AFib, they're tracking these patients over the long term to see if there's any difference in outcome using these devices. Coronary artery disease is another target disease that Apple Watch has been studied in, and that it shows that after a type 1 MI, a mobile app platform that includes a smartwatch, can be helpful in secondary prevention management. And of course, the obvious cardiac rehab, very widely studied with all of the activity trackers, and shows that home-based telerehabilitation using wearable sensors is equivalent or better than center-based rehab. But ultimately, I think this could be a really cool risk assessment tool. We know that decreased activity, increased heart rate, and decreased heart rate variability lead to increased mortality. We have these 3 devices that can measure these metrics daily, monthly, yearly, and beyond. And so I'm hopeful that one day we can kind of move beyond this somewhat stale 10-year risk predictor and move to something more dynamic and individualized to truly give a patient their personalized risk. So here's some references. And I was debating about taking questions between sections, but I'm going to continue. That was the longest section, by the way. Each of these could probably be their own Grand Rounds talk, but I'll carry on to the next section in sleep. And this is the infographic that the Essential 8 posts relating to sleep. I think this is their strongest infographic, talking about how sleep can impact cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, depression, and some really key recommendations to improve sleep. And a lot of it has to do with limiting device use at night, moving them away from the bed, consistent bedtimes, etc. So why do we care? inconsistent sleep patterns have been identified as a novel CVD risk factor. And we're all familiar with sleep disordered breathing, obstructive sleep apnea, and the detrimental effects it can have on our cardiovascular system. Not going to go through that. But OSA predicted a 2.4 increase in mortality and a higher CVD incidence over 7.5 years in a MESA cohort, free of known CVD at baseline. Up to 50% of OSA patients have hypertension, 30% of hypertensive patients have OSA, and the prevalence of sleep disordered breathing is higher in patients with AFib than matched controls. AFib is harder to control when patients have sleep disordered breathing, and more likely to recur is atrial fibrillation after ablation. But what about non-obstructors? And so this is an interesting study that looked at sleep patterns, which is the sleep duration standard deviation and the sleep onset timing standard deviation. And so we're looking at regular sleep patterns here that are pretty obvious, same bedtime, same awake time, versus irregular sleep patterns. It takes them longer to fall asleep. They're falling asleep at different times, waking up at different times. And you can see here on the x-axis, this is the 7-day standard deviation of sleep duration. And down here on the x-axis is the 7-day standard deviation of sleep onset timing. If you're varying your sleep time over the course of the week, you're at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. If you're varying the time you go to sleep each week, you're increasing your risk of cardiovascular disease. So both the duration and the onset timing of your sleep are important risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And so these devices track all of the things that I've mentioned already. Time of sleep, some of them do sleep stages individually, restlessness with their activity trackers, heart rate variability, and respirations. And so these are the 3 devices I mentioned before, and this is compared with the gold standard of PSG, which is done during a sleep study. And you can see that some of these devices here in the upper left is Apple Watch, a little bit less accurate when the sleep is less, but then funnels into, and these are minutes of sleep down here, but then becomes pretty accurate as the sleep increases. Same with Whoop. Whoop, again, you see a tighter variance here in Oura. Whoop and Oura are a little bit better than an Apple Watch, but Apple Watch also just released their own proprietary app that I think will improve these metrics pretty significantly. Moving into the non-wearable category, Sleep Number has gotten into sleep metric space, and you don't have to wear anything. You just sleep in the bed, and it tracks your sleep duration, your onset timing, average heart rate variability, and respiratory rate. And so this company has amassed 10 billion hours of sleep data from almost 2 billion sleep sessions. And the 360 Smart Bed actually adjusts to your positioning throughout the night. So if you're on your back, it's one thing. If it turns onto the side, it actually actively adjusts to reduce pressure points. And they report 28 more minutes per night of sleep when using Sleep Number. It's 170 hours a year. They have a collaboration with Mayo Clinic doing a variety of studies, which are pretty interesting. So bringing this closer to home, for those of you that listen to Spotify, this is similar to Spotify Wrapped. This was my sleep data on the Sleep Number bed in 2022. 8 hours and 21 minutes of duration, almost 8 hours of restful sleep, 66 resting heart rate, thank goodness it's below 70, and a respiratory rate of 18, which is a little bit higher. But it got a little bit more depressing from there. I had 78 nights of the 147 where I met my sleep goal. 101 nights only were efficient, and I met my ideal schedule 24 nights a year. So maybe that'll improve after fellowship, maybe not. Here are the 2 offerings that Sleep Number has from the least expensive to the most expensive. You can get one of these smart beds for $1,600, all the way up to about $12,500 if you get the heating and cooling metrics included. So Sleep Number tracks the data. There are other companies like 8 Sleep that actually aim to improve your sleep, and this is the hot or better cold area of sleep temperature. And so playing on the familiar, sleep is the new 10,000 steps, better make it count, and that you sleep deeper while your pod adjusts temperature to keep you asleep. And so this mattress cover can actually decrease the temperature of the bed all the way down to 55 degrees or increase it all the way up to 110. And so studies have shown that keeping sleep temperature within tight ranges increases deep sleep, and that improves your heart rate and heart rate variability. Interestingly, they used a validation study with Oura, so one device using another device to validate itself, and that 300 patients used Oura a month before using 8 Sleep, and then after or during 8 Sleep. Deep sleep increased 10% with 8 Sleep. HRV decreased by 6%, and heart rate decreased by 1%, and 2% for the heart rates greater than 70. And I'm not going to get into the details here, but some of the marketing claims don't necessarily match up with the study outcomes. So it's just important to educate your patients on what they should expect from some of these devices. The sleep cover itself is $2,500 to put on top of your own mattress. You can buy H Sleep's mattress package with the cooling for $3,600. This pains me, this next section. This is how to manage your weight and how to eat healthy. I think this is one of the things that we do the most poorly from a cardiology perspective, and I kind of have redacted some of these things. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but one of the things that we've certainly found is that calorie restriction doesn't actually lead to weight loss. It's never effective. And increased exercise doesn't actually lead to weight loss either. It's beneficial for a variety of reasons, but certainly not for weight loss. And the other thing here, the heart check, less of a fan of, because in its past and actually currently it's been seen on things like Frosted Flakes, right now instant Quaker oatmeal with maple syrup and brown sugar. So I'm less excited to talk about these, but it's obviously important for us to think about managing weight and eating healthy. And so this is a scientific statement about obesity, and we know that excess adiposity promotes changes in cardiac function directly through the effects of the myocardium and the vasculature, and indirectly through obesity-related conditions. And essentially all of these different organ systems with increased adiposity ultimately lead to heart failure. The good news is that lifestyle modification, this elusive term, with associated weight loss improves the diagnostic components of metabolic syndrome and associated pathophysiologic abnormalities such as inflammation and endothelial dysfunction. Obviously, this is a problem that's severe now and only getting larger. And so any sort of solution here is worth $1 bajillion, we'll put it that way. And so it's important to be able to measure these metrics first, as I've mentioned. And so smart scales are pretty ubiquitous at this point. This is a Withings scale, $80. So it's important to measure weight, obviously, and keep track of that over the long term. This was another scale I came across that's just pretty interesting that I think is best described as a possible non-invasive cardiomems that measures the body's fluid and hemodynamic status. Not a lot of other data out from that, but keep a lookout for that for the people that are taking care of heart failure patients. This device is really, as it claims, the first device to hack your metabolism, and it's called Lumen. I've got one right here. And Lumen is a pretty simple device in that you inhale through it, hold your breath for 10 seconds, and exhale through this flow channel here with a CO2 sensor and a flow meter on the other side. And what this measures is the respiratory exchange ratio, which looks at expired carbon dioxide and used oxygen. And so if your ratio is about 1, carbon dioxide to oxygen, your body's burning carbohydrates. If it's less than 1, about 0.7, doesn't get a whole lot lower than 0.7, your body's more likely burning fat as its metabolic energy preference. So this is how respiratory, the RER, used to be measured, and this is how it's measured now. And of course, the validation study here, RER on the x-axis, the lumen percent CO2, has a really strong correlation. And so the whole point of this is to increase your metabolism's flexibility. And they do this they claim through natural weight loss, less snacking, energy and mood boost, improved overall health, and enhanced weight maintenance. And in addition to actually getting the metric of whether you're burning fat or whether you're burning carbs, it gives you a dietary recommendation for the day based on your individualized data. And so not only does it say you should have a low, medium, or high carb day, but also provides instructional, informational videos, recipes, and other helpful educational materials. This device, $300 a year. If you want to pay for VIP access to their nutritionists, it's about $500. So again, not a cheap device, but really the first one that's looking directly at your metabolism. And I think a key component of that is the longitudinal aspect of the data, but also the coaching that you get along the way through the app itself. They're also marketing this to different weight loss and weight management clinics as a tool that patients can use daily instead of interacting with their nutritionist all the time. They have this educational component in the palm of their hand. And there certainly will be more to come as Lumen is actively looking to partner with research collaborators. So it'll be interesting to see how this metabolic flexibility plays out over the long term. This next section is something we're very familiar with, blood pressure. Not going to spend a whole lot of time on the data here. But we know that hypertensive patients have higher all-cause, CVD-specific, and cerebrovascular-specific mortality. This is just a reminder that taking a blood pressure, an accurate blood pressure, is difficult. And I think we need to at least mention this to our patients, some really important things like use an appropriate cuff size, avoid smoking, caffeinated beverages, activity 30 minutes before the measurement, rest for 5 minutes, and sit with your feet on the floor and legs uncrossed. This chart just shows the differences between clinic blood pressure measurements, ambulatory blood pressure monitor measurements, and 24-hour ABPM measurements. And meta-analyses of randomized control trials have shown that clinically useful reductions in systolic and diastolic blood pressure can be used with ambulatory blood pressure monitoring or home-based blood pressure monitoring. It's actually better to use those devices than usual care in clinic. And this educational trust has actually validated all these different blood pressure cuffs. One quick aside, ABPM, ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, out of scope for this talk, super important. It does better to predict long-term CVD outcomes than office blood pressure monitors do, and they work 15 to 30 minutes during the day, 15 to 60 at night, measure all of these different blood pressure metrics. And it's crazy how infrequently we use this technology, despite it giving us better data. Between 2007 and 2010, less than 1% of Medicare beneficiaries were billed for this, and it's a $52 reimbursement and essentially always covered. So I think we should be using this more. Extremely powerful tool. Some of the home blood pressure cuffs, Omron, really good brand, great reputation, range from $55 to $110. This one I definitely want to blow through. We don't manage actively type 1 diabetic patients. And we of course use specific diabetes medications in heart disease, but we know that diabetes is associated with all-cause and CVD mortality even after adjusting for CVD risk factors. There are continuous glucose monitors out there, and it's recommended by the diabetes associations. There's clear data for type 1 patients, murky data at best for type 2 patients at this point that use insulin, though I think that's going to change. What about non-diabetic patients? That's kind of the interesting part for me, in that early studies have shown that higher glucose variability, kind of like heart rate variability, except the opposite. If you have bigger swings of glucose, you're at higher risk of CVD, CVD death, Alzheimer's, frailty, cancer death, all-cause mortality. The logic shows that today's normal patient is tomorrow's diabetic patient. But at this point, these devices are truly cost prohibitive, $300 a month. Probably not going to be used by most patients, though some of these biohackers and performance optimizers are using these on a more regular basis. The data will be interesting to see it play out over the long term. Cholesterol. Again, we're not going to talk about the benefits of statins and other cholesterol-lowering medications here, but the important takeaway on this infographic here is taking medication as directed, and that's probably not as easy as it seems, as medication non-adherence contributes yearly to approximately 125,000 preventable deaths. 50% of CVD patients consistently take their medications. It's a really difficult problem to assess. We don't have good metrics for it. And it certainly remains an undermanaged problem. And interestingly, in the recent ischemia trial, 25% of patients self-reported medication non-adherence. Kind of an interesting thing to think about. In 2017, there was a state-of-the-art review looking at this problem and identifying the problem and the key factors that contribute. It's obviously a multifactorial problem with socioeconomic factors, healthcare system-related factors, concomitant illness, therapy-related factors, and patient-related factors. We all know this, we all see this, but I don't think we pay enough attention to it. So they propose 4 ways to reduce non-adherence. Identify monitoring methods, improve evidence-based to better understand adherence, develop patient health provider team-based engagement strategies, and alleviate health disparities. So enter Dose Health. This is the company that I'm affiliated with. Met Paul and Steve in medical school. Paul also had a degree in health informatics and dabbled in programming on the side. Steve was an aerospace engineer who custom built a 3D printer to build the early prototypes of this device. I was involved in another startup company, so they asked me to get involved to develop a business plan. Countless iterations of the software, the hardware, and the business plan ultimately led to this.
Introducing Dose Health. We have created a smart pill box that deeply integrates with intelligent software, making it a powerful adherence tool. After a brief setup, the device knows which medications and what times they need to be taken. When it is time, the device's internal tray rotates to reveal the correct pills. An alarm will sound to let the patient know it is time to take their meds. If a patient is late in taking their pills, text and email alerts can be set up to notify a caregiver. Taking the pills is as simple as turning the device over. And when the device is empty, a simple guide will walk you through filling the easily removable tray. Dose Health also provides crucial tracking data to help facilities and home care institutions improve the care they give. All of this in a small, affordable package. Dose Health, because every dose matters.
So that was a few years ago now, and fast forward to today, we have over 3.6 million tracked dispenses. 150,000 of those were missed. And so do that math, 96% adherence rate. And again, we're talking about 50% adherence rate being kind of a baseline. This truly is spectacular. The data is probably a little misleading, so maybe it's around 90% once we clean up some of the data, but it's a significant improvement over baseline. We're covered under Medicaid waiver service programs in 8 states, including Minnesota. We have over 4,000 clients and 6,500 devices on the market. And so it's not just for individuals, it's also for group homes, whether it's elderly homes, whether it's people with disabilities, and these devices are covered for both of those populations. The device itself is $60 a month, and that can be out-of-pocket pay, or it's paid for by these Medicaid waiver service programs. And so going back to those ways to substantially reduce non-adherence, Dose Health is a great monitoring method. We would certainly improve evidence base if we use these in conjunction with clinical trials to understand the actual adherence of these interventions. If we don't have the data, we can't talk about it. So with this data, we're able to develop patient and health provider team-based engagement strategies and figure out if they're not taking their medications, we know that, and we can ask why and try to figure out a better solution. And alleviating health disparities through the Medicaid waiver service programs that we're approved for. All right, last but not least, smoking cessation. Smoking is bad, we all know that. It's the most preventable cause of death in the United States. Nicotine cessation is one half of the equation. Nicotine is an addictive substance. We're not good at it. The best data that we have is a patch with gum or spray, and we're talking about a 36% cessation rate. So here's another device, and I'll go through this quickly because it's wild, but it's called Pavlok. Let's see if it plays here. We tested it earlier, it worked. It's not gonna work now, that's okay. Essentially what this device does is you wear it on the wrist, and habit is a huge part of how we live our lives. And they estimate in that video that 40% of our lives is lived in habit. And our brains are wired to just execute that habit over and over again. So I mentioned nicotine being part of the smoking cessation equation, habit is the other. And so aversion therapy or shock therapy has actually been a really well-studied field dating back to the 70s and 80s. And it turns out that humans are animals too. Pavlovian conditioning applies to us as well. And you associate a habit with a negative stimulus. So smoking, instead of that pleasure receptor, you associate it with a negative stimulus. And it does, the video itself, I wish it was playing because it plays like a Saturday Night Live skit, but it's real. And so the whole goal is to rewire your brain to stop liking the habit. And so this is an example of a study done in 1998 with 832 patients, 55% male, 3 phases. The first week was interview, simple. Second week, Monday through Friday, 1 hour, they would go into a telephone booth-sized room strapped with this electrical shock device that they titrated up to discomfort, and they would smoke in that room with a bunch of cigarette butts, with a bunch of ash, all the while being shocked. Picking up the cigarette, putting it to their lips, taking a puff, shocked for an hour. And the data is actually really incredible. 13-month follow-up, 52% of the patients were smoke-free after 13 months. And 30% of the non-smoker or the continued smokers were actually smoking less. And it turns out the greatest risk factor for not quitting was living with another smoker. So the authors hypothesized that if both members of the household were treated, these numbers would actually be better. So 35 years later, Pavlok has worked with the University of Massachusetts. Very small study, albeit to begin, but looking at 8 people, 2 weeks of therapy with the Pavlok. So every time you smoke, you shock yourself. 6 of them stopped completely within 2 weeks. We don't have long-term follow-up data. 2 cut down by 50%. Further studies are underway, and they are working toward FDA clearance and further clinical trials. So $220 device. Mine was on sale at the beginning of the year for $150. And of course, there's a monthly fee as well if you want to do certain challenges and get certain rewards. There are concerns with all of these devices. Accuracy is obviously crucial. We need to prevent digital overdiagnosis. We need standards to regulate these devices and just need unified policies. We need to separate the useful data from the not useful data. So we need randomized control trials with long-term follow-up, but we need a telehealth curriculum. We need to know what's out there. Patient privacy, another concern. Data de-identification, we need updated HIPAA policies to really encompass all of this new data coming in and really encourage patients to opt into these devices. Cost is a really important part because we know that a new health disparity could crop up as there's a 3-fold use difference of smart devices between those with high and low socioeconomic status. And if you bought all of the entry-level devices that I talked about, you're $2,500 up front. So this is not cheap, although I would argue that there are some more efficient ways to do this. So what does the future look like? I see a clinic. Maybe it's an individual building. Maybe it's a room within a clinic. Maybe it's not even a physical clinic at all, a virtual clinic. Something that teaches patients how to use these devices, integrates the data from all of these different tools, and really creates some sort of better outcome for everybody. And I think this will ultimately lead to more individualized care. And the most crucial point, in my opinion, is that we as physicians and advanced practice providers really need to spearhead this movement, because if we don't at least make ourselves aware of what's out there, I'm afraid we're going to be left behind, and our patients deserve better, we deserve better, and I think together with industry and building on some of these essential 8 lifestyle metrics, we can build that better future for our patients and for ourselves. Thank you. Sorry I ran a little late. I don't know if there's any time for questions. Totally okay if people jump off. Dr. Sharkey.
Well, that was really good. And so you can put your picture up there with the rest of them.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
What's your heart rate during this presentation?
That's a great question. I have the shock device on now, so I don't have my heart rate metric, but I'd say, it's probably good 80, 85 at this point.
So I take issue with Roy McIlroy. There's no way his heart rate was 120 I just don't believe it. That's cardiogenic shock heart rate.
And so what's interesting, well, that's exercise heart rate, but
he's walking without a bag, and I just don't believe it.
Yeah, so it's interesting. That was a 1-minute clip of a 15-minute long YouTube video of different players at different times in different tournaments, and so this is now pretty longitudinal data, and we know that Whoop really tracks heart rate well. That's their sweet spot, and so I would say, we just have to change the paradigm of golf.
Obviously, I have no idea. I just think it's really interesting.
It is.
One of the hospitalists at Waconia has a automatic blood pressure thing, and he would be very religious about it. And he showed me his data when he was on his week off. His blood pressure dropped by 20 points compared to his week on, and it was just very, very reproducible.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating when you start looking at these physiologic parameters.
Absolutely. And yeah, similar to that strain workout that I showed of that senior resident in the ICU, there's just tremendous sympathetic input during stressful situations. So that's really good data. And I think something that we just need to pay more attention to. Dr. Harris.
Joe, that was really fantastic. So thanks so much. You're going to be the go-to guy for personal questions about
anytime. I love this stuff.
What to get and how to interpret all this data I see on my phone now. I forgot to mention our exhibitor, United Therapeutics, so thanks for being here. One question and one comment is, besides the KardioMobile and the Apple Watch, do you see that any of the other devices out there right now are good enough to recommend for patients to detect arrhythmias?
No, I think those are the only 2 that I would feel comfortable recommending at this point.
And then I think just a commentary for us as a group is all our patients have some sort of device and they're compiling the data. They want to get it to us. And then we have to figure out a workflow to deal with even more medical messages and data coming in. I don't know. I'll leave that as food for thought.
Yeah, and I reached out to Dr. Bradley at the end of last week
Give me the-
because I
give
was
me the
really
mic.
curious to hear his take.
Right away, I'm just gonna stamp that one out, because first and foremost, the underlying assumption is more data is impactful for patient outcomes. The studies that have looked at this have shown that in fact that you can negate all of that. Some of the first studies were Fitbit. They gave Fitbit with the idea that giving them the data was going to increase their steps. They decreased their steps.
Mm-hmm.
Having the data is not necessarily impactful. So the underlying assumption we need to be careful about, because that's not necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
There probably are simple components of, there's just an educational misunderstanding of what patients recognize that they need to do. Are you active? Oh yeah, I'm active at work all the time. You have an understanding of, yeah, you're active. That's better than being sedentary, because that's as bad as being a smoker, but you're not getting exercise, right? So there's that component. And then I do believe that you need to be thoughtful about what are the data infrastructures that can be integrated in clinical practice to achieve better outcomes. I think there's tremendous data about how we can do that around blood pressure control. It's been there for a decade. Karen Margolis did this with Health Partners. The problem was that the way the clinical infrastructure was built required a clinical pharmacist to essentially manage the program, and they're rare as hen's teeth, and so you can't do that at a population-based level. Mass General has taken that concept and then gone and hired care navigators, which are essentially people who've graduated from undergrad but haven't quite got to medical school yet, and spend a year managing a panel of patients through what do they need to do from a health lifestyle standpoint, how they're addressing their salt intake, what are they doing in terms of fruits and vegetables, and on top of that, reviewing their blood pressure data to then follow an algorithm that up-titrates their thresholds in terms of medications they're on. They've done this around blood pressure and lipid profiles, and they just published, I think it was a week and a half ago, in JAMA Cardiology. Tremendous benefit for thousands of patients. And we're in the process of doing that here at MHI. We have a hypertension program leveraging remote management that we've rolled out in Eden Prairie. There's a huge learning curve for the health system as it relates to doing this. So we've currently got 3 patients enrolled, because it takes time to make sure that data is going to the right place, that's being reviewed by the right people, the algorithms being followed, the clinical outcomes are good, so on and so forth. But I think, Joe, to your point, that we'll call them the 1%ers, because I don't think it's 10% of the population who are going to leverage their data. I think it's helpful for us to understand how that can be beneficial to patients. But for 90% of the patients, if not more, I think there's a much larger divide in terms of how this data can be useful.
Fair enough. I think we will see in that maybe it doesn't integrate into our clinics, but if it doesn't, my thought is that industry will take that role. So I just hope that we as physicians play an active role in that development.
Yeah, and to your point, so industry is preying on our patients in terms of how this can be beneficial, and so I think at times we have to be help our patients be thoughtful about what data is really impactful for them.
Set expectations, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think there are good things. So I have conversations with patients about the one time we've seen their AFib, they're asymptomatic, it was in a such and such setting, hard to know if it's going to recur. Some of those patients, an Apple Watch is a great tool. And then I'm always surprised at how many of them have an excuse as to, why they don't want the Apple Watch either, even though that might be a great tool. But yeah, I think there's a lot on the future for us. I do think that there's a huge potential for the hype to get out in advance of how this is truly beneficial for patients.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Dr. Jensen, thank you so much for your time. We do have one question online. I know we're a little past time, but if
Absolutely, sure.
One more here. Well, first of all, Dr. Hauser says great presentation,
Yes.
followed up by a question from Dr. J, who asked just about the ownership of the data that's collected. The specific question is, do the EU LAs for these devices specify who owns the data from a given device?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not actually familiar with the data ownership and the devices. I don't know, Steve, if you have come across any of that, but the patient owns the data, and I think that's one of the things that in the concern category that patients need to opt into this, and then I don't know if it's individualized between the different devices, but I think and I need to clearly do a better job of understanding how that data ownership works, but I think that's something that's certainly going to evolve over the coming years. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.